Good afternoon. There's no more sacred right for a child than to grow up with your family. Something deprived from generations of First Nations children by the Government of Canada, first through the residential school era, and now as the Government of Canada tries to defend its inequitable and flawed funding for child welfare that has driven more First Nations children into foster care than there was in state care at the height of the residential school era. The thing about this that's so unique is that there's never been a case in the world where a developed country like Canada has literally been on trial for discriminating against a contemporary generation of First Nations children. That in itself should shock many Canadians. This is a case, after all, brought after over 10 years of joint work with the federal government to identify the inequality as being 22% less than other kids get, and to develop solutions. And back in 2007, with all of that available, they walked away from it. They walked away from First Nations kids. Over the next 6 years, they would spend millions of dollars trying to derail these hearings on legal technicalities. But finally, beginning last February, the truth started to come out. And the truth is very disturbing. If we only rely on the government's own documents, they call the funding for First Nations children woefully inadequate, creating a situation as dire. They have a document where they say the risk of children dying is extreme. And we need not look very far to realize in the case of Tina Fontaine how very real and tragic that is. There are other documents, the government's own documents, showing how First Nations children are denied services available to every other Canadian child. There's one that took my breath away. It says that a First Nations child who needs orthodontic care only gets that orthodontic care if they cannot eat or cannot talk. They cannot eat or cannot talk in the 11th richest country in the world. A child with a disability requires a wheelchair, a lift, and a stroller. Off reserve would get all those items when medically required. On reserve, a child only gets one of those items every 5 years, and the lift has to be self-installed. There was another spreadsheet that the federal government had drafted, and it had the very tragic story of a terminally ill 9-year-old girl. She needed a hospital bed to keep her at a 30% incline so she wouldn't go into respiratory distress. By the government's own admission, it took at least 9 months to a year of labored breathing for that child to get that bed that she wants. Now, you might be wondering if the government disagrees with this, and although publicly they may say so, but their own expert witness was dropped by the Government of Canada because KPMG, that expert, did a report, and their calculations of the funding inequalities came within 0.12% of our calculations. We filed that report as evidence of the inequality. This is a situation about children being driven, as the federal government's documents say, into foster care unnecessarily, being driven away from their families and their cultures and their communities. And it's not because the federal government is trying hard enough, although I suspect if you talk to them, they'll talk about the hundreds of millions they're already spending. What they won't tell you about is an international ranking that shows Canada to be 60th in the world in terms of the level of effort it puts into children and proportionate to its wealth. And the figures are even worse when you look at policy and legislative agendas, things that are right in the heart of the core of the federal government's responsibility. There, Canada ranks 115th in the world, right next to the Russian Federation. So Canada isn't doing what it can for First Nations children. It's doing what Vladimir Putin is doing for children in his own country. It's time for Canada to come together and to do what Canadians, fair-minded parents, loving aunts and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers all over this country expect, is that when it comes to kids, you put them first and yourself second. And we're a wealthy country, and our kids deserve the very best. I thank you very much, and I'm honored to introduce Ghislain Picard, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Bonjour à tous. Good afternoon. Avant d'être chef national, je suis avant tout un parent, un grand-parent. Et c'est une totale aberration de constater que dans un dossier comme celui-là, il faut avoir encore une fois recours aux tribunaux pour nous donner raison. Et dans ce cas-ci, ça a pris 7 ans depuis le dépôt de la plainte devant la Commission des droits de la personne, Commission canadienne des droits de la personne, pour finalement en arriver à cette étape-ci qui est extrêmement importante, c'est-à-dire d'entendre finalement les arguments des différentes parties, incluant les nôtres. Et, mais ce qui est encore plus aberrant, c'est le fait que nous soyons à une étape aussi où le Canada a décidé d'étirer les choses de façon à permettre à la communauté internationale de regarder ce qui se passe ici même sur le plan domestique et de constater qu'il y a, je pense que le terme n'est très certainement pas exagéré, une nette discrimination dans la façon dont c'est traité, dans ce cas-ci, les enfants autochtones sur réserve et par rapport à ceux qui sont situés hors réserve. Et je pense que c'est extrêmement important aussi de signaler le fait que, malgré toutes les représentations qui ont été faites, les arguments qui ont été extrêmement évidents sur les écarts qui existent importants entre la façon d'administrer les programmes lorsqu'il s'agit d'enfants sur réserve et la façon d'administrer les programmes lorsqu'il s'agit d'enfants hors réserve. Je pense ici que le choix que nous ayons finalement, la seule option que nous ayons qui est d'avoir recours au tribunal des droits de la personne, le tribunal canadien des droits de la personne, est extrêmement honteux pour le Canada comme pays. Et comme le disait si bien Mme Blackstock un peu plus tôt, le Canada rejoint d'autres pays où finalement il n'y a pas de politique qui soit efficace et qui convienne finalement aux enfants. I certainly want to take the time today to, obviously as chiefs, grand chiefs, leaders in this country, for our nations and communities, we could easily see that this case is no different than any other challenge that we have. But it is very different because it's about our children and the sacred place that they hold within our nations and communities. It's absolutely disturbing to see that Canada and the government would go to these extents to defend its case, in light of, I would say, striking evidence that there's discrepancies in terms of the services provided to our kids, our children. As leaders, as chiefs and grand chiefs across this country, there's not a day that goes by where we're not challenged with any aspect of the lives of our communities. So we need support, we need assistance, we need allies, and certainly the time would be proper for me to acknowledge and recognize and thank Cindy Blackstock for the work that she's been doing since day one on this case. And we certainly need all of the advocates that we need in order to bring this government to reason. And the last thing I will say is that, again, this is a good example or a classic example of what we've been attempting to do with this government. In 2005, we had a joint report between the Assembly of First Nations and this government that could have provided sufficient arguments in order to do things right. Yet this government chose to do things its own way and the wrong way for our peoples. This is what's really striking in this case. And certainly, again, we have to, as the last recourse, have to resort to a tribunal to, hear our case. And to us, it's very, I would say, frustrating that time and again we have to look to the tribunals and the courts to be on our side. Thank you. Merci.
Oui. Je peux vous poser une question?
Oui.
Quand vous parlez de discrimination envers les enfants, les familles des Premières Nations, est-ce que vous pouvez me donner quelques exemples concrets?
Bien, écoutez, c'est tout a lien, tout a rapport avec la formule de financement, qui, de toute évidence, ici, fait en sorte que, dans plusieurs cas, l'écart financier entre les services qui sont dévolus pour les communautés, pour les enfants hors communauté par rapport à ceux qui sont sur communauté est entre 22 et 34 je pense que c'est une évidence là qui est très certainement aberrante et qui fait en sorte que la cause que nous défendons depuis maintenant 7 ans repose sur cette seule réalité-là qui fait que l'écart est trop important. Pourquoi les enfants qui sont sur réserve méritent moins de services que ceux qui sont en dehors des communautés?
Vous avez dit que le gouvernement a tenté par tous les moyens de faire obstruction à la cause qui est actuellement devant le tribunal canadien. Pouvez-vous me dire comment ils ont fait ça? Puis, deuxièmement, qu'est-ce qu'une décision en votre faveur aurait pour effet concret? Donc, si jamais eux jugent effectivement qu'il y a discrimination, est-ce que le gouvernement devra corriger le tir? Est-ce qu'il va devoir simplement entendre le verdict?
Bien, écoutez, c'est ce que nous soutenons depuis le début. S'il y a je veux dire, des évidences à l'effet qu'il y a moins de services pour les enfants qui sont situés sur les communautés, bien, c'est qu'il doit y avoir réparation et le gouvernement doit pouvoir corriger sa politique en la matière. Et c'est ce qui a été débattu pendant au moins 3 ans, avant 2005, qui consistait à jeter un regard sur les politiques et comment elles étaient finalement différentes dépendamment des contextes. Et pour nous, l'argument, ça a toujours été, bon, est-ce qu'on peut remédier à la situation? Et on souhaite que la décision du tribunal sera de toute évidence en notre faveur et surtout à la faveur des enfants pour lesquels nous parlons aujourd'hui.
Il y a une obligation pour le gouvernement fédéral de corriger le tir si jamais le jugement est en sa défaveur?
Bien, écoutez, dans plusieurs cas, le gouvernement, je veux dire, on a eu un rapport assez accablant de l'ancien rapporteur spécial sur les droits des peuples autochtones, M. Anaya, au début de l'année, qui, encore une fois, nous mettait devant des évidences importantes sur plusieurs dossiers qui touchent la relation entre le gouvernement fédéral et les Premières Nations. Qu'est-ce que le gouvernement fédéral a décidé de faire? C'est qu'il a tout simplement décidé d'ignorer le rapport.
All of the new agreements that have been signed with the government and the provinces to deal with child welfare funding since this case was first brought, have they made any difference?
There certainly is an improvement in some of those regions. It's called the enhanced funding formula. It's not available anywhere else in the country, but the Auditor General reviewed that in 2008 and 2011 and found it to be flawed and inequitable in both of those cases. And had they actually taken the recommendations of the joint review that the National Chief talked about, many of these problems that are surfacing right now that are creating that flawed and inequitability would have been dealt with. So this is a situation, had they listened to their own report and invested then, we would have saved a lot of children a lot of harm right now. And so what we're asking for is the government to implement the solutions it's already identified. This isn't one of those problems where there is no solution. It's about doing the right thing for the children and stop using racial discrimination against children as a fiscal restraint measure. I think that goes against everything the country stands for.
A joint review, is that the one-day report?
That's a one-day report, and that actually is the same one that KPMG reviewed the calculations for. That was to try to refute those responses, presumably, because the government hired them as their expert witness. But the calculations came within 0.12% of our calculations. When the government realized that, they dropped KPMG as their expert witness, and they called no other expert.
And they found there was a $112 million discrepancy, right, between, what was the years, 2000? Like, what was the underfunding that you got that was found?
What we found is that we were phasing in, this is in 2005 dollars, so you would have to advance that into contemporary times. But it would start as an initial investment of $109 million a year just to meet basic levels of service, and then it should rise to $167 million. And there was even provision that that probably wouldn't achieve full equity, but that would go a long way to doing it. The federal government, of course, has not done that. And in some regions, for example, in British Columbia, New Brunswick, the Yukon Territory, and Newfoundland Labrador, those children haven't had any increase in funding in about 25 years. So you think about inflation losses way back then, those are the days before didn't even have the World Wide Web. And these agencies are trying to run on that level of funding. So it really creates, as the government's documents say, a woefully underfunded and in dire situation.
That report, that joint oversight, which included people from the AFN and the department, and you got your.
That's right. We
Go ahead, sorry.
Well, we commissioned experts, leading experts from all over the country, including 5 economists, to help us with that report, because we're very concerned about not only identifying where the problems were, but where the money could be best invested for maximum outcomes for kids. And we had leading economists on that, including Dr. Jochen Loxley, who is one of the expert witnesses for our side that confirmed that KPMG report came so close to his own calculations.
Chief Picard, on a side note, the AFN, the program proposals that you guys were waiting on, I think there's about 14. Can you give us an update on if any more have been approved? What do you know about the matter?
Well, obviously, a majority of the proposals that we submitted, some of them have yet to get a response, but a majority of them have been just rejected by Canada. It really, I would say, impacts negatively on the operations of the Assembly of First Nations. And when you seek for answers, we got the same kind of reaction as we did with the Wendy report, with the Kelowna Accord. No explanation whatsoever as to what what's behind the refusals. And this is, again, a reflection of the many frustrating attempts we've made at engaging government. And the projects that you're referring to are just another example of the result.
What's that going to mean for staff at the AFN? Are you going to have to lay people off?
Well, obviously, it impacts negatively on the ability and capacity of the Assembly of First Nations as a national organization. It's really in the hands of the government to provide the responses that are required. They had committed to providing those responses early in the year. No, we are now into the fall of 2014 for projects that were submitted late last fiscal year. So this is something that we'll certainly will have to look at.
One of the things I might just add is the government's defense of their own documents that say all these things about the inequalities and these dramatic harms for children. Their best response to that is that they're only personal views of the government, even though some of these documents are downloaded from their own website. They said, don't take the Auditor General, give her reports only minimal weight because you haven't called her as a witness. But as many of you know from the Auditor General's Act, no one can call the Auditor General for a witness. So I think when you pierce through the veil of the communication notes of the federal government, they really don't have a case to say that what they're doing is in the best interest of children. And it's really been quite sad for me to watch and to see them really protecting themselves more than really taking this opportunity to do right by kids. Because that's what we really want, for the government to look good by doing the right thing for kids and for kids to have the childhood that they deserve.
I just wanted to get the timeline on the rejection of the one-day report. They were rejected in 2007, but the report issued its recommendations 2005. What
they did is they actually accepted the report in 2005. They actually funded the report and they signed off on the report and participated in the report. They just never implemented it to be able to make the difference for kids. And that's why we had to file that complaint. Once we filed the complaint, in 2010, they commissioned the KPMG expert report to try and refute our findings. And that's when they found it within the 0.012%. The hearings went ahead in 2013, and at that time, the federal government had KPMG on its witness list. But when our witness, Dr. Loxley, went through the calculations and drew their attention to the fact that our calculations were only 0.12% away from theirs, they dropped KPMG as an expert witness.
But did Get it, the department ever say, we're not going to ever implement these?
One of the things that happened at AFN is that before the complaint was filed, the then National Chief, Phil Fontaine, actually reached out to Minister Prentice at the time and said, really, we really want to see these things happen for kids. If it doesn't happen for children, given the dramatic impacts, the increased numbers of kids in care, will have no choice but to file this complaint, but we really don't want to file it. But there was no response from the minister. And if we look at to today, where they're just down on Bell Street, on Elgin Street, fighting against this complaint, I think it was the right decision to do, because I haven't had any signal from them that they would do the right thing on their own, sadly.
You never got any actual rationale for the department not accepting those recommendations in disclosure or anything like that?
No, and in fact, they say they accept those recommendations. Well, that is the question I think you need to ask the government, because that has never been made entirely clear to us. And we actually looked for that response even in their closing submissions. But as I say, the closing submissions factor more on legal technicalities and on this trying to distance themselves from their own documents and their own experts than anything else.
Monsieur Picard, aussi un peu dans la même veine, entre 2005, on a parlé d'un document en 2005 qui a été élaboré, mais entre 2005 et 2007, il y a eu un changement de gouvernement. Est-ce que le changement de gouvernement a contribué à un changement de ton concernant ces problématiques-là?
Bien, écoutez, je peux tout simplement vous référer à la logique, finalement, s'il y en a une, de la réponse gouvernementale. L'exemple qui me vient à l'esprit, c'est l'accord de Kelowna, où le gouvernement précédent avait signé quand même un accord important qui comportait des sommes extrêmement importantes pour redresser la situation sur le plan social et économique. Et le premier geste que ce gouvernement-ci a posé, c'est de mettre l'accord de Kelowna au rencard. Et c'est le même cas ici, et toujours sans vraiment de réponse substantielle ou de réponse qui puisse expliquer son geste. Et je pense que c'est une question qui très certainement mériterait d'être posée au gouvernement fédéral.
Juste en terminant, pour vrai, qu'est-ce que vous répondez aux gens qui vont répliquer qu'il y a des problèmes de gestion financière dans les réserves, puis qu'il y a peut-être une partie du problème qui est là plutôt que de la discrimination à la base? Est-ce qu'il y a peut-être une partie de ça qui explique le problème ou...
Bien, écoutez, on parle d'enfants ici. Et pour nous, on parle d'une situation qui n'existe nulle part ailleurs, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a une démographie qui confirme une croissance importante du nombre de gens, donc du nombre de cas également. Et comme le disait Mme Blackstock un peu plus tôt, la situation est telle qu'il y a des chiffres extrêmement préoccupants et inquiétants sur le nombre d'enfants placés dans les communautés. La question d'imputabilité, de transparence se situe à un autre niveau. Et ce qu'on dit ici par rapport à ces questions-là, c'est qu'on était engagé avec le gouvernement précédent, encore une fois, dans un processus qui visait à renforcer la capacité des communautés d'être transparentes, imputables envers leur population. Et encore ici, un autre exemple d'un processus finalement pour lequel le gouvernement actuel finalement a tourné le dos. Et je pense qu'on ne peut pas ici très certainement nous accuser de mauvaise volonté.
Cindy, you've been monitored, your Facebook has been monitored, your status file has been perused for reasons we don't really know yet. How do you, did you ever envision yourself as being such a threat that you pay such a high personal cost for this?
Well,
There's a retaliation aspect to this.
There's a
right?
retaliation complaint, because after we filed the complaint, I discovered DVDs of emails and where the federal government was clearly following me personally. They were noting where I was, and they were also noting where I was not, which troubled me even more. They were on my personal Facebook page. They collected personal information about me and about my friends who were posting on the page. The Privacy Commissioner investigated that, found the Government of Canada to be unlawful, And the complaint here at the human rights proceeding was amended to include retaliation. And that evidence was heard last year. And actually, we don't know why the government was trying to follow me. One of the emails that was put before the tribunal said that they were trying to find other motives for the filing of the child welfare case so they could get it thrown out on vexatious grounds. Now, they didn't find those other motives because there are no other motives. And even when it comes to this retaliation complaint, I am entitled to a personal award should the tribunal find they retaliated. But I have always said I'm not taking the money. I'm going to donate it to children's charities because this is not about money. This is about every Canadian having a right to speak out when they see something that's wrong in ways that are respectful and in ways that are keeping with our democracy. So I'm hoping that people get inspired by my story to not remain silent when they see something that's wrong and needs to change, because I'm not going to remain silent no matter what they do.